You may or may not know that 70% of the world's food, maybe something that you're eating right now, is produced by small-scale and family-run farms. So when we move towards sustainability, the eyes are very much on the farming community, and it's a big ask on pretty small shoulders to move towards total sustainability. So what we would like to do is ask, how can we connect the world's oldest industry with the newest technologies to change the way that we are growing food as we move into a new decade? We have got a fantastic panelists waiting for you in our green room, and we're going to be led by a very exciting moderator for you this hour, Keith Bradsher. He is the Shanghai Bureau Chief from the New York Times. So a big round of applause, please, for Keith and his team. Hi, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our panelists on stage now. We have Anna Banks, Chief Marketing Officer for Fair Trade USA. We have Marc Engel, the Chief Supply Chain Officer from Unilever. We have Monica Grycka from Gastromotiva in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a social enterprise working on providing new ways for people to eat and consume foods and connect with these smallholders. And finally, we have Gert Sylvest, co-founder of Tradeshift itself. With that, let's get started. Anna, there's a general perception that small-scale farmers around the world are in constant difficulty, real trouble. Is that beginning to change? Are there some hopeful signs?
Yeah, well, I would love to use three industries as or three commodities as kind of an example to see what's going on right now. So let's take a look at coffee and cocoa and coconut. So coffee in particular, there are 21 million families around the globe that make their living against coffee, and coffee it's the silent humanitarian crisis, to be blunt. Coffee right now, it's $1.10 a pound. And think about, you paid for your latte $5, only a few cents of that actually made it back to the farmers who grew the beans that are out there. So it costs more than that to actually produce a pound of coffee. So it's a loss leader crop right now. And when you have an incident like that, you have farmers that decide, like, I'm going to abandon the crop, go on to something else. I am going to actually, seek asylum somewhere else. So that's an example of a commodity that's actually in crisis. So then you go on to cocoa. So cocoa is one of those, 60% of it produced in West Africa and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. In 2018, Fair Trade International did a study saying 7% of cocoa farmers are living above the poverty lines of families that are producing cocoa. So another one that's in a dire situation where the price to produce the raw material is below the cost that it takes to actually create it. The third one I want to go on to is coconut. So coconut, and there are so many products that contain coconut, so don't just think your fancy coconut waters. It's also in detergents, it's in lotions, it's in lip balms, it's in a variety of our products. So it is a very integral crop. It is another one that comes from smallholder farmers in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. Another one, the price is below what it costs to produce. And so you see a crisis going on there where the smallholder farmers there are facing a place where many of the trees were planted in World War II, right? And the average life of a coconut tree is 50 to 60 years. So you're looking at a point now where many of those trees are very mature, they're declining in their yield. And so in order for that industry to continue, there's a need for planting of new trees. And yet you have farmers, they're not making enough to actually cover their costs, so they don't have enough money to start replanting. So you have an industry that's a little bit in crisis because there are no sources of financing to really kind of recatalyze that particular industry. So just those three, I think there's so many small scale farmers in each of those that covers so much, and that's just, each of those are case in point in the real kind of crisis that we're seeing and the disparity between the price of what we're paying for these and the price of what is really needed to actually execute and bring those commodities to market.
Marc, you have a very broad experience, whether it was running a ragu spaghetti factory in the Netherlands or ice cream in Latin America. How can technology be used to give more opportunities, more options to the small-scale farmers whom Anna is describing, who are in many cases in crisis now?
Now, technology is everything. And if you allow me 1 or 2 minutes, I mean, there are about 500 million smallholders in the world, and there are about 2 billion people that are deriving their livelihood from farmers, mostly in these smallholders. So this is a very big part of the population. In a linear traditional chain, you have the smallholder, you have the trader that picks up the goods, and then the aggregator, and then the processor, and then the distributor, and then it comes to companies like us, and then it goes to people like you in your homes. The reality of a normal smallholder is on Thursday, the guy with the truck comes along, he tells you what your tomatoes are worth. He takes your tomatoes and you hope that he comes back in a week with payment, because, or maybe not. And that is the reality very often of a smallholder farmer. And so what smallholders need is they need access to markets, they need to know market prices, they need access to finance, they need access to inputs, they need access to agricultural expertise. And technology is absolutely the game changer, because all of a sudden that linear chain where companies like us are 5 steps away from millions of smallholders, we deal with millions of smallholders, but 10 years ago nobody in my company had actually met one of them. It really allows you to make a much better impact on these 5 things that they need. So technology is an absolute game changer for smallholder farming, in my opinion.
Okay. Nicola, women make up 43% of the global agricultural labor force, and they often haven't been empowered. Are there ways you're seeing, particularly perhaps right now in Brazil, that technology is helping to remove some of the obstacles that women in agriculture have long encountered, particularly small-scale farming?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, in some regions, it's even above 43. That's the average. Asia, Africa, it's above 50. So that is not only a workforce, but it's a force for change. And actually, there are studies that women are more open to bringing in innovations and testing out technologies. Men tend to be more stuck in old ways of doing things when it comes to agriculture. And so having a focus on empowering those women, since we know they are more foreign to test and innovate, is already a big point to invest in the woman and put her at the center. Women, as we know as well, you will invest in a woman, you invest in the family, and invest in the community. So building communities is extremely important, and going from what you said, from food chain to food networks. So cutting out the third parties, creating these circular things, because nature is circular. And I think, again, then bringing the woman at the center of it, we can really bring strong communities, because what we see as well, that young people are not going into farming anymore. They're going into the cities, they're not staying. So creating, these social networks as well. We work with social gastronomy. So putting the social element, women at the center, and linking it with technology, but not high tech. Let's keep it simple. The simplest things will make the biggest difference. And so let's focus on things like even predicting weather, drones to bring food to market, or even access to market, like cutting out that third party so that they have more influence on the pricing. So I think, these are all elements that I think that see a future. Again, we can start with a woman and they will influence the whole community.
Okay. Gert, the newest challenge for small-scale farmers is African swine fever, which has proved to be the biggest livestock epidemic since World War I. It has already killed about 1/4 of the world's pigs, and it's not just a problem in China now, it's East Timor, it's devastated the Vietnamese small-scale farming, a big problem in the Philippines. What, if any, lessons are there from technology now in terms of trying to provide information to these small-scale farmers? I was, for example, in central China, in a very remote rural area 2 months ago, talking to pig farmers, and they were very unsure what to do next. The big dilemma for them was that pig prices had tripled. And so if, on the one hand, they were strongly considering trying to get back into the pig business, even though their entire herds had died, because they wanted to cash in on those high prices. On the other hand, it was also a very large initial investment for them even to buy the piglets to restart production. So how can technology address these kinds of very sudden challenges that might confront the world's small-scale farmers?
It's a good question, and I think it's a pattern that we see repeated everywhere. I think if we go to the root of it, it really has to do with transparency, right? So you have 90% of all companies in the world not understanding what is happening beyond the tier 1 of their supply chain. So there is a huge digitization challenge in the supply chains, because today there is no efficient way of actually understanding what happens in the supply chain for most companies. And what does that mean? I mean, there are large brands everywhere in the world that are actually very willing to invest in the supply chains all the way down to the smallholders, because of course, what happens at the smallholder level, we heard it represents 70% of the food that we're actually consuming. And therefore it impacts you, it impacts me, it impacts the big brands, it impacts the local community. But how do you invest to actually break that pattern and change the way that people produce, how you give people access to information? I think that's a big challenge. And I'm very much aligned that technology has everything to do with this, because that's about how you channel knowledge back to people, how you get information back. You can make smart investment decisions. You can improve infrastructure. You can give people access to market. You can give people identities, access to finance, and all these things. So I think the transparency challenge is really, to me, also a challenge of digitization. And I think it's a common pattern everywhere in B2B that we haven't been able to break this digitization in per se. So what can digitization do to that? I think it's a little bit about the economic patterns that we apply, because we've seen, especially in the supply chains pattern, where, let's say, large companies especially have digital supply chain initiatives that they're pushing down the supply chains, but often the effect doesn't go to the end. So I think we need to think along the lines of networks or ecosystems of supply chains rather than the linear thinking, and thinking about how we can create new economic models that can actually stimulate everybody in there, including the smallholder farmers. And my team was on the ground in Indonesia as well, and saw how often smallholder farmers are powerless in the sense that they lack knowledge to understand even simple things like how to combat a fungal infection that can increase their crop by 50%. But right now, all the good initiatives run by NGOs and sometimes large brands and processors, they seem to not be scalable. So I think indeed technology and good economic models around that is kind of the key to that. Yeah, but the good question is, of course, how?
I would love to build on that. I mean, I think you called out something so key. Like, there's this weird dichotomy. There are all these technology companies that have all these amazing things that they know, water sensors and soil sensors, and they've created technology over here. And then there are all these organizations that have had relationships on the ground with farmers for years. Prior to many of these startups. And it's all about the two of them starting to come together. The people who have the technology and the people who have had the relationships with the smallholder farmers coming together to collaborate to create something that is simple enough for the average rural farmer to actually implement in their own environment, right? You don't want to create so much complexity that it's just unwieldy. And so the idea that there are so many disparate types of technology that they all need to figure out how to come together to create a cohesive solution that's actually going to work for the farmers. Now, the flip side of that is you have all these different solutions. They're going to create a ton of data. And then you need to figure out who's going to own that data, who's going to benefit from that data. So we might talk about that a little bit later, but that's a whole nother dimension to this is, we don't want to create another generation of winners and losers where we create all this wonderful data from this and the farmers themselves don't get to actually benefit from it. So creating a system that's simple enough that it generates data that the larger organizations can use it, but the farmers themselves can actually benefit from the data that's being generated as well.
The element of trust is important, like you're mentioning, and I think the trust that already exists on the grounds. And we were speaking this week actually with a representative of farmers' organization, and he was saying farmers are scared to integrating innovation and technologies. First of all, they're the only risk takers in that moment, because then if you purchase, you're not going to go to that supplier, you go to someone else if it didn't work out. So we need to find mechanisms to lower that risk, as well, of implementation of technologies, as simple as they are, and to create mechanisms, as well, protection mechanisms built on trust, I think.
Well, now, Anna, you were talking a little bit about cocoa earlier, which has been very important for several economies in West Africa. And I'm wondering whether technology is helping to protect those against new areas of competition. 4 years ago, I was in easternmost Java in Sarawak, where there's an enormous new chocolate factory built by an agribusiness, which has helped finance the planting of very large cocoa plantations in direct competition with some of these small-scale farmers that you're talking about in West Africa. Are there ways through technology that these small-scale farmers in West Africa, for example, can see that competition coming and respond or stay competitive?
Yeah, so one of the things that I love is that we start to see companies that, I think this was brought up earlier, who start to have relationships directly with smaller farmers and start to have that relationship with the source of their product. And that's when you start to see the benefits of that kind of get combined there, where you can start to deliver the insight to the farmers around like, so what are the crops that you actually potentially could get more for, so that you can actually get them to shift what they're producing. You can get them to shift the way they're actually perhaps processing the product overall. We see that in cocoa in particular. You probably heard of rose cocoa, which is now kind of like the hot commodity and can command a significantly higher price. So the ability to take data like that and connect it directly to the farmers who can then kind of change their behavior to the benefit of their communities, because it starts to generate incremental income.
Yeah, it was easternmost Java, it wasn't Sarawak as I'm thinking about it, but it was supplying the Asian market. How has the incredibly fast growth of Asian demand for a lot of these higher end products, a lot of these more elaborated agribusiness products, affected how you look at supply chains at Unilever? Are you needing to change your emphasis where you're producing, where you're gathering the crops, Marc?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a mix, but of course for us is the closer to the market, the better. There's also a consumer element in this, because consumers are more and more wanting to know where's the food coming from that I'm eating, who has plucked my tea, but unfortunately, palm oil doesn't grow in Switzerland. So, there are some crops where you have to go on world markets. But I come back to the point again about technology, is that technology is it's more connectivity than technology. I agree. You need to keep it very simple. It starts from the fact that you can walk with a mobile phone. You walk the perimeter of the land, and then you have the land. And we have to remember 500 million smallholders. They are the stewards of the land. We're here this week. We talk about decarbonization. We're talking about climate. This is also a group that is very, very influential to how far we're going to meet our climate goals or not. The engagement of it and making sure that they're doing the right thing. You have to make sure they earn enough money. And it's very simple. If you have a 2-hectare farm and you produce cocoa, the only way to stay competitive is to get more cocoa out of your hectare. And that's why they need the access to the 5 things: the pricing, the inputs, the technology, the fertilizers, the pesticides, etc., etc. And so giving people access and giving people agronomic training, what we do a lot in Africa, in Unilever with tea, we have a relationship with 500,000 smallholder farmers, where we basically look at satellite imaging, and we give them the fertilization schedules, or we look at whether drought or wetness is coming, weather forecast, but more than just saying the sun is shining tomorrow, and when do they need to pluck, and when do they need to wait, etc., etc. It's all about helping, let's say, getting the farmer more income per hectare. And then the other point, which is very important, is that the more you can get the money being managed by the female in the family, the better chances you have of better livelihoods. And so one of our trainings is not just agronomic training, but it's also budgeting and home finance, where we always want to, let's say, invite the women. It's very funny because you see all the women are working on the field, and then you have a farmer field school, as we call it, and all the men show up. And you say, yeah, but where are the people who are doing the work? And so making that change is incredibly important to create better livelihood for this group.
Well, now, Nicola, actually, great segue from Marc there in terms of talking about local food. But Gastromotivo has exactly pioneered some of these as a social enterprise ways to connect farmers and chefs, for that matter, in Brazil. can you give us some really specific examples? Because so often people talk about technology in generality. Is there a specific farm even, a small farm, that you can think of in Brazil that has managed to connect with, for example, your founder, a famous chef, or with other chefs and food producers in new ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting point, and thank you for making the bridge, because there are 2 points around it. First, the chefs became more superstars overnight. They were always in the back of the kitchen as suppliers, and now they became superstars. So they started gaining a voice of influence. That actually, there was a study in the US recently that is the most trusted voice nowadays in the United States. The voice of a chef. So we trust because we put something into our body, which literally becomes us, right? So the famous term, we are what we eat. And so we want to know where it comes from. That's after the blockchain element that can be interlinked. But coming back to that, so local chefs, not only in Brazil, but we have a global network for the social gastronomy movement. And they started with choices that they do, influence the choices we do at home as well. So they give light and they tell the stories of the farmers. So even creating an identity around it. So in Peru, there was a big chefs movement around that, giving identity to local products, which then increased visibility for small farmers. In Brazil, you wanted a Brazilian example?
Yes.
We have Alex Atala, it's one of our best chefs. And his whole cuisine concept is based on local, on indigenous, on lost cultures, because food is culture as well. And so he started this movement about the local farmers. He brings the stories to the table. So in the menu, you literally will see the story of who produced that product and how did it get here. So the transparency piece again. You get to eat ants from the Amazonas. So there's also the, giving light to new products, because diversity is extremely important when it comes to the future of the fields as well. So I think the chef's role is that, linking us directly as the consumers to the farmers, to the produce itself, and as well creating these movements of demand. Because you can, as a chef, create demand towards something. So there is a crisis in Italy. Some people might know, because this was on Netflix, earthquake, and then the Parmigianos all broke. And how do we now produce demand for Parmigiano? Chef Massimo Bottura said, okay, I'm going to create 3 recipes out to the world, and let's start this movement. And all of a sudden, they purchased all the Parmigiano, so there is no waste. And so that's the power that I see chefs can play in this network as well.
I would even add to that. I mean, we're going to reach a point where we potentially could stand in the supermarket and scan a QR code and be able to actually see the person who produced the food that we grew, right? And know all about it, like, what were the techniques that they use? And, that's not that far away to be able to, so if we had that level of traceability and transparency.
Walmart is a good example as well.
Yeah. But also, if you wanted to donate 50 cents to the family who plucked your tea, that should be possible, but the money actually ending up there.
Absolutely.
So I think this is the holy grail, when we're not that far away from that.
Yeah. Well, now speaking of Gert, speaking of technology, Gert, you at Tradeshift have specialized in looking at this, and one of the subjects that people always wonder about, including as they talk about local food that Nicola is wondering about, is it grown with clean water? Is it grown in clean soil? Small-scale farmers often haven't had the kind of access to pollution information. Is there a big chemical factory up the river that's dumping pollution into the river, for example? What have you seen in terms of interesting experiments providing information about pollution to small-scale farmers?
No, that's a good question. So I think maybe one example is what we've seen in China, where there's a store chain called Hema Fresh Store, where the whole concept is actually built around, if you go into the store, everything you can QR code, you can get the history of what is the produce there. And I think that serves exactly that kind of purpose of connecting the consumer with ultimately, the specific farmer and even the specific cow where for example, a slice of beef comes from. So that's just enabling this kind of two-way communication and connecting the consumer ultimately with how was the food produced. And I think that is kind of the foundation for bringing information back. It's very similar to the financial flow. If you want to invest, It's about getting information, it's about getting market intelligence, it's about, you mentioned input materials, it's about getting knowledge back there, but it has a cost deploying this. And I think we see a lot of good blueprints around the world, pioneered by NGOs and others. But what a lot of them have in common is that they are actually not scalable because we tend to work in silos, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of insights that we share with farmers or insights we get on the field that we share back with big food and fast-moving consumer brands is shared in the form of 500-page PDF reports or Excel sheets and so on. And they're not shared within that whole community. And I think that's a big deficit. I think we will see, I absolutely believe that in 10 years you could connect 100 million smallholder farmers if you just agreed on some simple principles of sharing information in this network and giving the farmers actually ownership of their own data, of their own identities. But it seems there are no or only a few emerging players actually trying to do this in the market.
Okay. Coming back to you, Anna, to what extent are there also opportunities for small-scale farmers to diversify where they get their incomes? I'm thinking, for example, I went for the New York Times 4 years ago to a village of destitute sharecroppers in India. These were the poorest of the poor, mud huts. They didn't thatch roofs. They had almost nothing. And a factory town was being built nearby. And the workers were very worried that they wouldn't have any more millet to cut. And then I went back last summer, 4 years later, to see what had become of that village. And in particular, I managed to find one woman, a young woman who'd been very worried that her only skill was using a scythe to cut millet. What would she be able to do? And to my happy surprise, she had been able to get work part-time gardening at the edge of one of the factories, and the factories were hiring a lot of landscaping people. And as a result, she was able to spend several days a week with her 2 extremely young baby daughters, whereas her mother had worked 6 and 7 days a week through the whole time that she had very small children. So are there opportunities now, and maybe through technology, small-scale farmers can find them, to do more than just plant maybe the same crop or do the same activities that their parents and grandparents did?
Yeah, I mean, I think you are seeing kind of an evolution of what farming looks like, and it's absolutely necessary. I mean, many of the coffee farmers that we talk to, they don't want their children to become coffee farmers because they're worried that there's sort of the stigma attached to the way it was incarnated, the way, the sort of back-breaking work that you use as an example. So that the next generation, that it is going to be a little bit more of this sort of mixed use. Like there's a little bit of a coffee farming, but there's an opportunity for other elements that go into the mix of the income for that particular farmer. So I visited a farm in Colombia, which was an example of that. So they were organic coffee farmers, but they were also growing other crops that they had learned were also in demand with the land that they had, so they had better optimization of their land. They're also able to take some of the food that's grown and consume it themselves, right? So now you're addressing issues of food insecurity. So this sort of like multi-use polycropping, I think we're moving away from, single crop, mass use sort of model, and we're discovering that that's not very efficient for anybody and not sustainable. And moving to a place where how can we optimize all of the different levels? Like how can we keep the canopy where the coffee trees are growing so there's additional cover, so we're using actually less water, and then there's actually ground cover. So it's a very different model, I think, that we're moving to overall in the way sort of all agriculture is expressed in a lot of different commodities. So I don't know if you build on that.
Marc, I'm actually very curious to ask you more about tea, which you were mentioning, and you do have all that experience in East Africa. About 10 years ago, I went to the area around Hangzhou, China, and the Chinese government was spending enormous amounts of money to plow up hillsides and plant tea farms on them. Why? Because under Chinese law, if you convert land from rural agricultural use to urban use, you must find some other place in China to bring new land under cultivation so that the total amount of rural land, the total amount of farmland in China does not diminish. Yeah. And because all the flat land was already being farmed across much of China, particularly in the areas at least that have enough water, they were looking to hillsides, trying to figure out what can we plant on the hillsides, and they were chopping up the hillsides and planting tea farms. People were asking 10 years ago, how is Kenya going to survive? Because it is so dependent on tea production.
Yeah.
Well, you've watched in detail that industry. You talked about the 500,000 tea farmers. Yeah. How is it that small-scale farmers have managed to survive and compete faced with this big sort of industrial scale challenge on tea?
I think it is also the land right side in Kenya is very particular that sort of keeps smallholders, let's say, very favorable. But it's also because the climate is very ideal for tea there. So it's hilly, it's cold in the night, it rains a lot. And so it's actually, if you have 2 hectares, it actually does make a difference because you can send your children off to university with 2 hectares of tea if you look after it well. So it's not necessarily that there is the need for this is a poverty or substandard, etc. In Kenya, there are let's say a number of core plantations that have also the factories, because smallholders don't have green tea leaf factories. Right. And basically, we have a big ecosystem, and everybody has a number of outgrowers of smallholder farmers. But they're sort of part of the community. They get the same training, they get the same tools, they get the same access, etc., etc. And when you look at the economics of that, when you do that well, when the yields of the smallholders are very similar to the yields in the plantations, it's actually a very healthy economic case for this group of people. And it's in Kenya. It's not just with tea. It's also with vegetables and tomatoes, etc., etc. But I think they're very blessed with East Africa is very blessed with a good agricultural climate, and therefore it's also culturally a very an agricultural rich country, and the land right laws don't lend themselves very easily for consolidation. I think that's also, it depends also on the laws every country, and China, you know, when the government has set their mind on something, then it happens. That is just the reality of China. So I think, but in Africa particularly, that is because, you know, of course that we need to maintain the rainforest, and in Kenya there's a very particular issue with the Mau forest that is basically, the Mau forest is in the middle of the country and it is producing all the rain every day. It rains every day. And all the tea plantations need that rain for the tea to grow, because that's the part of the climate. But that Mau forest is being cut. But the GDP of Kenya is 25% tea. So it's not only nice for the planet, but it's also if I would be in charge of Kenya, I would be very concerned about a big economic driver getting lost.
That makes a lot of sense. At Gastromotiva, you have looked, among other issues, at recipes and what people can cook. Are there some recipes that Gastromotiva has tried to give preference to as a way to encourage people to choose products that tend to be produced by small farmers? And if so, how are you using technology to get that information out?
Well, we focus on a big element as well, the food waste element.
Yes.
And there is food waste along the chain, right? From in Africa particularly, the problem lies exactly at the farm because of infrastructure issues. And then in more developed countries, when in the United States, we waste at the consumption side. And so what we focused on a lot beyond just the produce is really the food waste recipes. Because it creates a different consciousness. And so we could actually feed the entire world with the food that we waste, right? And we're not valuing, so it's all interlinked, right, in the end. But if we value the work of a small farmer or of any farmer, we value the food, and we wouldn't waste if we value it. And so the recipes we focus on is, yes, creative recipes on how to use banana peels or overripe fruits, different campaigns around that. There's so much creativity in the young students that we train, so the future for us, the new chef, the new mindset that doesn't waste. And I think that's all things we can do at home as well. And bit by these consumption behaviors as well, we influence the lives of the producers. And I think that's where innovations like blockchain, knowing where the produce comes from, the transparency piece, knowing who produced, it's all interlinked. But in form of recipes, we can tell stories. And again, the chef is the storyteller. And I think for me as well, the future, how can we, you asked about diversifying the work of farmers, how can we bring the piece of gastronomy, of social gastronomy, into the communities as well? Because then, yes, families don't want their children to stay anymore in this business and send them out, actually. But if you create a livelihood, these communities, again, these networks, all interlinked with the food at its center and the celebration of sitting at a table, I think that's where we see that intersection of gastronomy with farming, and let's make the farmers, the female farmers, the next superstars of agriculture.
It's great to have a CEO of a social enterprise like you on this panel. Gert, we're down to about just a little over a minute, and I thought you'd be, in some ways, the best person, actually, to wrap this up. What do you think now are the biggest lessons that we now have on how technology can help small-scale farmers?
Yeah. So again, I think it's in some of the blueprints and trends that we're already seeing happening. We talked about what happens with the younger generation. Will they go into agriculture in the same way? And I think absolutely not. What we've seen in Indonesia is a young generation that's better educated. They want to make a difference. Maybe they will not be farmers, but I think they can be the connectors. I think it might sound wrong, but since I'm a San Francisco-based company, it's not about San Francisco-based companies flying choppers and sprinkling blockchains all over these places. I think the role technology has to play is actually to enable all the local talent, the entrepreneurs that can connect people, that can bring the stories forward, that can disintermediate the economic transactions and so on, so that you can create a local innovation. And I think that's where the difference is going to happen.
It all kind of comes down to the human side of sustainability and connectivity with technology.
Yeah. Thank you all, whether it's been cocoa, whether it's been tea, whether it's been pollution control, whether it's been reducing food waste. Great panel. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.